And now we'll have Dr. Hao Wang, New Mexico Tech. He's going to be speaking to applied economics with a focus on the energy transition. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have slides. I think I make it quick. So I will just speak of my experience here working at New Mexico Tech and the research we have done in the last 5-7 years, how I think about the energy transition, especially on the economic development part, because that's kind of my focus. So I have been here with New Mexico Tech for about a little over 7 years. If I can call it a career, the first few years I worked with the PwC and Dr. Bosch on some of the Permian Basin work. That phase of the research was mostly on the impact study. So we try to see the traditional oil gas production and the growth of that, and what's the economic and social benefit of that to the region, especially New Mexico. So during that phase, I was still trying to pretend myself was an environmental economist. That's what I was trained back in the PhD days. But eventually, in the last 3-4 years, I'm more transitioning into a regional economic development person. So I'm currently serving on the Economic Development Association that serves the central New Mexico, called the Middle Rio Grande Economic Development Association, which basically fills the gap between Albuquerque and Las Cruces, if you wonder the geography. And I have also been funded by mostly USDA and NSF to study some of the challenge, both energy and energy transition and environmental issue that's in the Southern High Plains, which is kind of overlapping with the Permian Basin, depending on how you look at the geography. So in the last few years, I have been involved in a few projects between New Mexico and Texas, because I was on sabbatical leave at the Bureau of Economic Geology and UT Austin the last entire year. So I worked on a few projects with people from UT and Houston area, especially, for example, there's a blue hydrogen and ammonia project that's put up by Exxon in the Baytown area south of Houston. So I'm one of the consultants on the economic impact study on that project. So we also work on the other project we have been working on is what's called the low carbon intensity ammonia, which is basically one of the value chain of the natural gas industry. So as we all know, ammonia is basically from natural gas for the most part at the industrial scale, and that's the most important input to the agriculture industry because it's the fertilizer. So and historically the industry the carbon footprint is high, which is basically by definition. And we try to, as part of the energy transition, you would think about the decarbonization process, how the value chain can be improved. So in other words, while we think about the technology and the decarbonization, we need to also think about the economic opportunity and all the value-added component that can be created through that process, because that's how you convince people this is something that's for the future, right? So it creates jobs, it creates more value, it creates a market. So that's kind of where my research as an economist comes in. So so in general, when I think about this kind of project or problem opportunity, we think from 3 components or 3 aspects. One is the technology. For the most part, we believe the technology is either ready or almost ready. The challenges from economics perspective, the challenge usually comes from the other 2 aspects. One is the workforce. In some sense, you can just call it economic development, but in this kind of in our region, Southern High Plains, New Mexico, Western Texas, workforce is usually the big part of the economic development problem. The third aspect is usually the policy. So when we think about policy, we always think about subsidy, because a lot of these energy transition program wouldn't happen just automatically. So, for example, when we were working on the fertilizer, the ammonia project, so we look into different USDA program and how their budget is being made. If you heard about the farm bills, that's where actually not only the food stamps comes from, it's also a lot of energy and environmental program subsidy comes from when it comes to rural American. So, for example, say if you want farmers to adopt your low carbon intensity ammonia, which is made from natural gas with CCUS component that helps with the decarbonization, it will make it more expensive. Then you want subsidy to actually make it acceptable to the farmers, because otherwise it's the same fertilizer. Why you want to pay for more expensive ones? So we will look into program like EQIP, which is the Environment Quality Improvement Program from USDA. That's part of the Farm Bill that supports a lot of subsidy programs. So that's the policy aspect we try to look at. And we also work on things like that's in general called the bioeconomy. It's not necessarily originated from the oil and natural gas industry, but it's kind of parallel. It's still in the, when we were talking about this before the panel, it's kind of still in the baby step where you are still trying to figure out how the pilot program happens. So in general, the bioeconomy idea would go from biomass to say biogas or renewable gas, and that whole process as it scales up, it will create alternative source for renewable energy, and it also creates other products, which is what we call the value chain or value added products. For example, biofertilizer, building materials. Because it's a biomass, so when you take away the energy parts, there's still materials left. So when we think, that's how we, from economic development perspective, we think about the energy transition. So you want to think the expansion of the value chain as wide as possible, so you can identify different sections of the value chain or different potential pathways where you can create a diversity of jobs. And because at the end of the day, when you think about economic development, the number of jobs is the first thing. So we were talking about this when you shut down the power plant and you try or you do something similar, you are going to take away jobs, right? But the people, it's probably going to still stay in the community, so they need new jobs. How you make that transition, not just on the technology side, but also on the jobs and economic development side. And usually there's a mismatch because the newer demand for skills may be not the same as what the current population has. So education programs comes in, and how to fill in that gap is very important. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that's helpful. So again, if I can summarize in 3 words, it will be technology, workforce, and policy. That's how you make the energy transition happen properly as you expected. So thank you.
Okay, so following up on that, one of the experiences that I referred to earlier was my time with the MAP and then the methane rule with New Mexico. And the main memory I had was going back after each meeting every 2 weeks to the operations manager in Artesia, New Mexico, and saying, these are the goals, these are expectations. And that individual, still have a very good relationship, would say, you got to understand, I've always been told smash gas, get it moved on. This is not what I've been told to capture at that kind of a level. I can do it. I have 200 people to work for me. Give me time to change everything, re-engineer, and do all this work. So along those lines, for Dr. Yang, one of the things we were talking about was a power plant. And a curiosity I had, again, back to Matthew's comment earlier, is if you tell a population that the target is this, such as the power plant, the target is CO2 removal, compared to, shut down the power plant, no involvement. What does it look like if you involve people proactively? How do you do that to get everybody on board to hopefully hit the target, keep the jobs?
I think one important thing is to let them understand why it's important to not to close a power plant, but why is it important to reduce carbon emissions and also the local pollutants of carbon emission. And then to tell them what will be the benefit for them, to let them see there's a benefit to them so that they can be actively involved and then be willing to be part of it, this transition process. And also giving them the options to be involved and then think through within their community, what do they need? What kind of skill training do they need to move away from these things? And also to help with these transition will be more important. So giving them the education, the information, I think that's the first step. And also, as economists, we're always trying to gather data to think about, to quantify things, right? It's what's the benefit, what's the cost. So having that information first, and then being able to give them the correct information, and then tell them what will be the process of transition and having a time frame that is reasonable would also be important to get, I think, community like support for these kind of process.
Thank you. And Dr. Mao, you were talking about the various uses of injection formations or storage formations, hydrogen or CO2. What are your thoughts on using or mapping out the best use for formations across maybe at least New Mexico? Is, this one possibly better for hydrogen, this one possibly better for CO2? Has there been any work done on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a great question. So for CO2 storage and the hydrogen storage, actually, even though the gas it seems like the gas component is different, but actually they behave also very differently. Like for CO2, we just need to inject CO2 into the geological formations and to keep it safe and it doesn't leak and over a long period of time. But for hydrogen, there is another important consideration is that we want to recover the hydrogen. So we inject hydrogen into the geological formation. We want to recover as much as possible. Otherwise, the hydrogen is lost and the money is lost, right? So then these difference will also cause difference in geological site selection. And for example, for CO2 for our current study, we find that if the geological formation has higher porosity and higher permeability, it might lead to higher recoverability during underground hydrogen storage. And but for CO2 sequestration, probably that's not always the case, but we haven't done that. But I assume for CO2 storage, the pressure buildup is very important. And we need to see the geomechanical risks. We need to evaluate the geomechanical risks of.
Comes up.
Battery died.
Okay, yeah, so for CO2 storage, probably we will put more emphasis on the geomechanical risks. For example, the pressure buildup cannot be so high. So that emphasis is different from hydrogen storage, because hydrogen storage will put more emphasis on recoverability and also the purity. So these two different requirements will end up with different ideal geological formations for these two applications.
That's very, very helpful to me. Very, very educational. I hadn't thought of all that. So, Dr. Balch, in relation to energy transitions, how do they vary in geography, locally, globally, or also rural, urban, all the variations?
Wow. I'll try and limit myself to a minute, but that could be like 3 or 4 days. So, I mean, if you remember looking at the windmill and solar maps from the previous panel, you could see that there are big areas of the country where solar doesn't necessarily work and they're far away from wind. So those places are also far away from where you can transmit power from those places where you do have surplus wind and solar. To me, that highlights that you have to look locally for what the best solution is. In New Mexico, solar backed by wind is great. It works wonderfully. But solar has real problems if you're in the north part of Alaska in the winter. It's not going to be functional at all. Or in Minnesota, where it's cloudy 200 days a year. It's less effective. So think about other ways you can decarbonize the power in those places. Maybe you need to have a nuclear plant, or maybe you have to have carbon capture on a gas plant. Maybe you have to rely on hydropower or something like that. So And then I do want to spread it out to the world, because I was just talking about the US, but there are places in the world that don't have energy the way we have energy. It's a couple of years old now, but um, a couple of years ago, Africa had 5% of people had power all the time, and India 20%. And these are places that are now developing, especially in the global south, also South Asia, and generally have more power than that. But India is a great example of where it's not. They don't have the economics to do things the expensive way, to get to those 40, 50% subsidy levels that make it affordable in New Mexico to put up solar panels, is challenging for India to do. The energy minister of India came out and said, you know, $32 trillion and we'll take care of our carbon emissions. And they said, the reason for that is you have legacy emissions. The world has already created a trillion tons of CO2, mostly in the West, over the last 250 years. So the legacy emissions is part of the problem, and other people trying to get to where we are going to use the least expensive way to do it. And in a sense, that's going to require us figuring out ways to decarbonize power and then giving that technology away and making it cost effective.
Thank you very much. And then I have one that's bothered me for a couple of years. So whoever wants to answer this one. So I was on a call with a number of stakeholders a couple of years ago, and there was a young family that was represented, and it was talking about energy transition. I believe it was with a tribe. I don't remember the tribe, but it's a young family, and the person was saying that I'm having to heat my house with a wood burning stove. And all that he heard was, just wait for it. We're going to deliver you solar panels, batteries, and a Tesla. And I kept going, just bring him a propane tank. Like, just start somewhere, because the Tesla probably never got delivered. He's probably still heating his house with wood. So what do you say to that in the transition? How do you address, in my mind, some stair steps that may need to happen?
I can try that since it's kind of case study, so I can try that with the example. So when we work on the USDA project, we have to engage with a lot of farmers. Basically, we talk to farmers why you don't just use the fertilizers. So we did quite some research with the UT on evaluating the possibility of what's called a agrivoltaic system for the Southern High Plains, and so the idea is wonderful. It has a financial model. It has a technology. There's tons of land there that can be covered by this. It will reduce the evapotranspiration, generates electricity. But there's one big problem. It's the finance part. The farmers can't take that much risk. So there's no decision-making tools. There's no resource helps them to manage that risk. So that goes back to the propane idea, right? So you have all these newer technology, a more efficient technology that potentially works or even bring a lot of more benefits. But the problem is, can they afford the technology, or can they do they have the infrastructure actually to use that? So it has to be something that has relatively low risk at the very beginning of the adoption and financially makes sense for a regular small family, right? So that's the thing. When we think about economic development and outreach at the ground level, that's always the thing we think first.
No, appreciate that. Thank you. We have 10 more minutes and open the floor to questions from the group.
A question for Dr. Balk. So we saw the US decarbonize most of its emission by switching from coal to natural gas. So can you talk about the potential for that worldwide or global scale?
I think that's pretty interesting. Around 2012, I looked at the distribution of power in the US, where it was coming from. And at that point, it was like 35% coal and a few percent natural gas, and maybe it was a little bit different than that. But if you go back to 2000, it was like 40 to 42% coal. And what the US has done is produce so much natural gas that they could actually make it cheaper than coal, cheaper than dirt, basically, because that's what coal is. And we've effectively taken a third of our emissions away by switching to natural gas. So that's a transitional step, like what Matt was saying, where maybe you don't go straight to the end point. You find something in the middle that helps, solves part of the problem. So if you look at gas production in 2050, you see large surpluses from the US and from Russia and a little bit from the Middle East. So to the extent that you can migrate those resources across the world, they can do the same thing. Like if Russia has 14 trillion cubic feet of extra gas in 2050 and they're giving it all to China to burn instead of coal plants, then that makes a big difference. So I think that there's a place it could play. It does cost money and energy to liquefy natural gas. It costs money to transport it by ship. So you should try and keep it as regional as possible. The bigger challenge there would then become geopolitics, right? So you could see a world where the West is providing to the West and the East and the South are providing to themselves as well. So I don't know if it's a great solution, but it's certainly a way you could do it. A lot of other industries, glass, things like that, I know you're familiar with that from your study in Europe. If you want to reduce the carbon now, while you're looking for a better way to electrify those processes and a grid that can support electrifying industrial processes, then natural gas could be a great bridge. And burning natural gas is half the carbon of burning coal.
Thank you. I'm going to get a tad nerdy here. Dr. Mao, talking about the techno-economic analysis of hydrogen storage. That is really cool. A couple of things there. One, you said that comparing it to pumped hydro, which has basically a duration of less than 12 or up to 12 hours. I didn't really understand that. I mean, that might be the duration for how long you can withdraw it, but you could save it seasonally, right? It has a seasonal range. It seems to me like on a scale, it's similar to utilization of hydrogen. And secondly, like hydrogen, or no, like pumped hydro, hydrogen is very, very location dependent, right? So how reasonable is it? How likely are there places where we could do it in New Mexico?
Thank you for your question. So for your first question, yeah, so in my slides, I said that the hydropower can discharge for 12 hours or less. And hydrogen storage basically can discharge power from daily to seasonal. So the thing you mentioned that we can just store the hydropower for seasons, for a season, and then, but that's not the scale I meant to be. Like I meant. So the scale basically is decided by the storage capacity. So for hydropower, even though you can keep the energy for seasons, but you cannot increase the storage capacity. And for geological formations, we have a lot of empty space there, and we can store a huge amount of hydrogen. So which means the energy storage capacity is very high. So we can keep discharging the energy for seasons. Okay. So that's for your first question.
Okay, I appreciate that.
And for a second question, so you talk about the availability of hydrogen in New Mexico to do underground hydrogen storage?
No, the availability of caverns or deposits or whatever it takes underground.
Yeah,
Geologic formation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, geological underground hydrogen storage, in terms of the geological formations, it's much more naturally abundant than the places that we can do hydropower. Because for hydropower, we need water. The water is we have so many water scarce regions, so we cannot do hydropower. And for hydrogen storage, we can inject hydrogen into different types of geological formations, including salt caverns, depleted oil and gas reservoirs, and the saline aquifers. So if we add up all these geological formations, it's like significantly, much significantly high, like more available than like water So we have a lot of saline aquifers. We have a lot of depleted oil and gas reservoirs. Like we have so many wells. After we produce oil and gas, those spaces are empty, and we can just put hydrogen there. And if it's a gas reservoir, it basically means that the formation integrity is very good because it can form the gas reservoir. So that's kind of an evidence that we probably can also keep hydrogen underground very safely. So yeah, I think we have a lot of space.
Okay, thank you. Can I pose another question? Okay, I'll pose one to Dr. Yang then. Thank you for those answers. Your work on looking at equity and solar access for underserved communities and populations is so valuable and so important. And I looking at your final slide where you had these plots of where the tax relief has applied and where it hasn't, I found myself a little lost. Could you tell us what is your final conclusion there and your recommendation for how we should be really enhancing access for these underserved communities and families to distributed clean energy resources? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for accrediting my work. In that last slide, which I showed that there's about like more than 50% of installed solar system that did not claim for tax credit, which was a huge puzzle for me when I saw it first. It's like people are leaving money on the table and not taking it. And then so my work is to look at why, right? Or what can we do to help those people claim those credit, which are designed for them to help them reduce their financial stress on adopting solar capacity. So what we show is that it's the household that have higher education, already more income, and then also more adopting more higher capacity in solar systems are claiming those credits. So these flip side would be that if households have smaller systems, they are more likely to lease the system, which are not qualifying those tax credits. And households that are less educated or do not have the means to apply for those credits do not get them. So one thing is information burden. That is, they might not know about it. Another thing is an administrative burden. So I myself installed solar. I went through the whole process of applying and getting the tax credit, which I had to bundle up a whole like 10 different documents from my utility, my solar installer, my HOA, for all that things to be in a bundle in order to submit that application package, which in itself will create some sort of an information and administrative burden for people. And some people might not just let it go and then not take it. So one thing would be, having more targeted programs, more targeted outreach to these people to make sure that they are aware of it. And also, there was one idea passing around when I was talking to people from MNERD, that is maybe having an energy coach. So you tell people that these are the things that you need to do to get it. You walk them through the process, make it as easy as possible for them to actually benefit from it.
Hi, this is a question for Dr. Mao. When I think about a depleted natural gas reservoir, that reservoir took millions of years to form and accumulate that natural gas versus our human time frame of trying to store hydrogen in that space in the amount of time we have. And I wonder what is the boundary essentially of that unit to hold that hydrogen in place. And the second part to the question is, I don't think of depletion so much as it's an empty space, but it's probably, uneconomic natural gas residue in there. And does that affect the economics of the hydrogen storage when you're trying to withdraw?
Oh, thank you for a question. So that's a great question. And for the first question, we store hydrogen usually like we have an annual cycle. Like we inject hydrogen for 3 months, and we shut in the well for another 3 months to kind of let the reservoir equilibrate, and then we withdraw hydrogen for 3 months, and then we idle again, or we shut in the well again. So that's one typical like schedule for underground hydrogen storage. Or we can do like half-year injection and a half-year withdrawal. and we keep the same cycle over, for example, 20 or 30 years. And so this is about the schedule and all the time frame. And so for your second question, it's a great question. And yeah, we do, this problem is very important. So if we are storing hydrogen in the depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs, we will have some residual gas or like leftover methane, right? Or other like oil. So then when we are recovering the hydrogen, we will also end up producing a lot of methane, which can lower the hydrogen purity. So this is a very important issue because it really depends on what type of applications we want to use for hydrogen. For example, if we want to use hydrogen for fuel cell, which requires a very high hydrogen purity, like 99.9%, then we probably need to purify the hydrogen on the surface, and that can add additional cost. But if we want to use hydrogen for power generation, so basically just combust hydrogen, and if the hydrogen is mixed with methane, so that's not a big problem. We can still use to generate power, and probably that additional cost is kind of removed. So it really depends on the hydrogen usage. And if it's very high, it has a very high requirement of purity, then it will become a problem, and it will affect our techno-economic analysis a lot. But if it's just for power generation, probably it's fine.
I would add in there too, because of the nature of seals and also the difference between hydrogen and methane. Methane molecule is much, much bigger than a hydrogen molecule. Just because it can contain methane doesn't mean it can contain hydrogen. So in all of these things, just like with carbon storage and anything you're putting into the ground for storage or taking out or you want to contain, you have to do your research. You have to go to the lab. You have to study the cap rock. You have to make sure that there's not a lot of well bores that are not properly closed, things like that, to make sure that the site is going to be appropriately fit for that particular purpose. But I would say that from my point of view, I would not first go to depleted reservoirs for hydrogen. I would go to saline aquifers and then do the research.